And good morning, everyone. Just want to say thank you to Paola and David for organising this conference and for inviting me to speak. I've titled this talk, Chasing the Trace, or the Fascination of the Photograph. In her book, Glitch Feminism, Legacy Russell proposes that we are no longer either a physical presence situated in a physical world or an online digital version of ourselves, but our existence is a hybrid of these that has been recentered to the extent that we are now either online or AFK, away from the keyboard and temporarily offline. It follows that the medium by which we have traditionally documented and evidenced our physical lives has itself gone through a similar process of recentering and redefining. The mechanisms around image capture and image creation have become increasingly blurred, and the notion of photography being an indexical system of drawing with light now seems somewhat outdated. Using both historic imagery and some more recent examples from my own practice, I would just like to explore a few thoughts arising from this transformation and why breaking free from more traditional definitions of photography can help us understand the current photographic landscape. This is AS 17-148-22727, the image that we now refer to as the blue marble. And when we look back over the last 50 years or so since this image was made, it's easy to become romantically nostalgic for an era in which things appeared to be safer and more straightforward, especially given the precarious state of the world. I believe this image represents a photographic marker, both culturally and also photohistorically. The photographic medium has changed fundamentally since 1972, to the point where it is hard to define what a photograph actually is, and consequently how to read it. And I'd like to expand these ideas a little, and to attempt to address some of the photographic reasons behind the blue marble's significance by looking at the image itself, and also a series of my current recent work. The blue marble wasn't the first photograph showing the Earth as a whole disk or sphere. That was made by the unmanned ATS-3, a geostationary satellite in operation from 1967 to 2001. It wasn't the first image taken by a person. That was Earthrise of 1968 by William Anders in Apollo 8. It wasn't the last image showing the whole Earth this way. NASA has subsequently released numerous versions, including a black marble, showing the Earth at night. The 1972 image, or the series of similar images from which the blue marble was selected, was, however, the last using an analog camera and traditional film by a human being, the astronaut, composing the shot in real time, shooting through the window of a spacecraft on the way to the moon. No human has been far enough away from the Earth to capture a similar whole Earth image since. On Thursday, the 7th of December, 1972, in the command module of Apollo 17, 5 hours and 6 minutes into the last and longest manned mission to the moon, either Commander Gene Cernan, command module pilot Ronald Evans, or lunar module pilot Jack Schmitt took this photograph through the circular hatch window of the command module. Even reading the mission transcript, we don't actually know who. They passed the slightly modified Hasselblad 500EL with an 80mm lens loaded with 70mm Kodak Ektachrome transparency film between them. And NASA has always attributed the authorship to all 3 crew members. These details illustrate the analog and manual nature of the photographic process at this time, which involved sending a photographer out to witness and record the event and returning them and the film back to the lab to get it processed. It is, in effect, a certificate of presence, to quote Vered Memon discussing Fox Talbot's early botanical works, which he himself termed the pencil of nature. In 1972, we knew this because we thought we understood what a photograph was. Photography, though, is a problematic medium. On the face of it, it seems so straightforward, objective even, its meaning easy to decode. In Camera Lucida, Roland Barthes concluded that the essence of photography can be summed up in the phrase, "that has been," and that he could never deny that the thing had been there. So when holding a photograph, there is, in his words, a fundamental belief that the thing photographed had existed. There was a direct link to its referent that nothing could undo or disprove unless the print he was holding was not a photograph. Similarly, in the ontology of the photographic image, André Bazin states, the objective nature of photography confers on it a quality of credibility absent from all other picture making. In spite of any objections our critical spirit may offer, we are forced to accept as real the existence of the object reproduced. Photography enjoys a certain advantage in virtue of this transference of reality from the thing to its representation. This transference of reality, direct trace of a referent or indexicality, is as direct a sign as footprints in the sand, signifying a human presence, and is, as Bazin goes on to suggest, more significant to the ontology of the photographic medium than a realistic representation of the referent. C.S. Peirce agrees. A photograph is both index and icon, but its iconicity, i.e. the resemblance of the image to the referent to which it points, is of a secondary status. And by way of illustration, the image on the left is Niepce's heliograph, considered to be the world's first permanent photograph from 1826, against Samuel Hoogstraten's almost photoreal trompe-l'oeil still life oil painting from 1664. Since 1972, NASA has produced further blue marble style images, but these have all been digital composites derived from satellite data. The process is fundamentally different, and our relationship to the resultant imagery appears to be different too, as they seem to be less culturally significant. Are these images photographed, and does it matter whether they are or not? In 1924, approximately 50 years before Apollo 17, Captain John Noel financed an expedition hoping to conquer the summit of Mount Everest. In return for the expedition's sole image rights, the first time that these had even been considered. Like NASA, photographic equipment had to be modified or designed and constructed, and a method to retrieve and process the film devised. This time, though, in a purpose-built lab in Darjeeling, where Noel had purchased a plot of land and installed developing tanks, drying apparatus, chemicals, and an electric generator. A network of runners, dispatch riders, and the Indian Postal Service carried the film from Noel's position 22,000 feet up the mountain and 3 miles away from the summit to the processing lab 100 miles away. The resulting film, The Epic of Everest, from which these images are stills, is available from the BFI and is even more poignant as it records the departure up the mountain of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, who subsequently perished either on their ascent to or return from the summit. The nature of the analog process, the inextricable, unavoidable indexical link to what we see unfolding on the screen, means that when we view the footage, we feel the weight of this loss. In his book, The Configured Eye, W.J. Mitchell writes on digital photography, there is simply no equivalent to the permanently archived, physically unique photographic negative. Image files are ephemeral that can be copied and transmitted virtually instantly. The only difference between an original file and a copy is the tagged recording time and the date of creation, and that can easily be changed. Image files, therefore, leave no trail, and it's impossible to establish with certainty the provenance of a digital image. As Peter Benson writes in his essay, The Ontology of Photography, From Analog to Digital, referring to digital photography, the connection to the real thing photographed has been severed and replaced by its connection to a string of zeros and ones stored in a computer file. In light of this, then, a digital image, at least according to Barth's definition, is not a photograph at all. In the past 30 years, we have moved on tremendously from a simple form of digital capture, which itself was the first major revolution in the medium since the invention 150 years earlier. Computational photoreal image making, such as computer-generated imagery, CGI, often abandons the vaguest attempt to suggest a real-world referent, but can confuse us by often appearing in some way photographic. When we look back at the 1972 blue marble image, we think we know that has been. We're assuming that we see what the photographer saw. And although the image itself has been cropped, rotated, and filtered through a variety of optics, development processes, etc., we are at least aware that the imagery refers back to the origins of photography, in that, as Fox Talbot writes in 1844, they have been formed or depicted by optical and chemical means alone. But when we look at more recent photographic style imagery whose origins we presume to be at least partly digital, we have no such confidence. As Katrina Sluice and Daniel Rubenstein write, one of the insights afforded to us by computational photography is the understanding that whether the image has a resemblance to an object or not has little to do with indexicality. Rather, it has everything to do with the algorithmic processes that operate on the raw data collected by the light-sensitive sensors in a camera. The same data could just as easily be output as a text file, a sound, a string of numbers, or remain unprocessed. Technical developments in the medium and the ability to create photoreal imagery computationally without a preference to a referent means that we believe all imagery less, particularly those with whose referent we have no direct experience, images from space, for example. Our relationship to the medium has changed fundamentally, and on the face of it at least, confused. Although writing several years before the release of the first consumer digital camera, writer and media theorist Willem Flusser's thoughts on photography and other technical imagery are, I think, helpful. In fact, his distance from the current multitude of digital image creation techniques and the networked image culture that consumes us helps us to take a step back from it all in order to try to clarify our thoughts. Writing in the early 1980s, when digital images were in their infancy, and many years before the current landscape of image-based network communication, in towards a philosophy of photography and then developed further into the universe of technical images, Flusser suggests that as humans, our behavior relies far more on learned rather than genetic-based information. And the structure through which this is carried has a decisive influence on how we attempt to navigate our way through the world. This was initially through what he termed traditional images, cave painting, oil painting, drawing, for example. They weren't necessarily painted from life. The Peshmerga cave paintings, for example, were 800 meters below ground. But they were, according to Flusser, a mimetic complex system of signs arranged in a non-linear way on a two-dimensional surface. He claims that as this class of imagery increased in complexity, the semiological decoding of these signs became increasingly confusing, and texts and linear writing were invented to explain these original images, organizing the system of signs in a seemingly less ambiguous linear order, facilitating historical and critical thought. In time, this category too became confusingly complex, and linguistic communication, both the spoken and the written word, were no longer capable of clearly transmitting the appropriate information. So out of these texts developed technical images, photography, video, film, television, computer imagery. Often appearing to the contrary, this class of imagery is 2 steps further removed from the world through which they are attempting to help us navigate than traditional images. Although arguably potentially still mimetic, especially pre-digital photography, according to Flusser, these new codes do not represent the world, but act as models or visualizations. He goes on to suggest that a digitally mapped world transcribed into synthetic imagery with the use of computers is the only way to facilitate a clear and distinct communication of thoughts, ideas, and concepts. It's important to note, though, that Flusser doesn't limit technical imagery to that which is digitally created, but he does regard electronic imagery as a purer, ultimate form. This, too, can help clarify our perspective on the major technical revolution in photography as it transitioned from analog to digital capture, and the plethora of algorithmic image-generating systems that have arisen since. If photography and other forms of technical imagery are visualizations, it acts as a validation and unlocks a huge potential freedom to break away from the constraints of the definitions we traditionally consider necessary to the medium. It gives us a freedom to play with alternative indexical options, as well as, for example, create computer-generated imagery without having to bind it to the photographic or photoreal aesthetic. If we move then away from recording the trace of a visual reference and use binary data as the input instead, which can be derived from any suitable digital source, the photograph or photoreal visualization is an algorithmic reordering of this data. We can therefore make illustrative imagery of things we cannot photograph. Alan Warburton, in his wonderful video essay Goodbye Uncanny Valley, calls this theoretical photorealism, phenomena which is, in his words, unobserved but according to the laws of physics, visually accurate. The example he gives is a visualization of a black hole from the movie Interstellar, but could equally apply on a micro scale to medical imaging, for example. Similarly, looking at mountains is a series of work I made in which the images are simulated photographs created using open source geological elevation data. The height of the Earth's entire surface has been mapped using a variety of methods, from NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission, LiDAR data collection, conventional topographic maps to traditional ground surveys. This has been collected, collated, and located in the public domain. For the creation of these images, the data was imported into 3D modeling software and output as algorithmically generated photo-style images that intentionally directly reference those produced by John Knoll in 1924. And although I didn't have to jeopardize my life, design new cameras and lenses, employ a team of runners and dispatch riders, or buy any land in Darjeeling, that narrative is indeed seen through my imagery, and Knoll's is seen through his. They are topographically relatively accurate, but that isn't derived from the mechanical recording of the geometry in front of the camera, but is produced directly from a data-based reference. I'll finish with another image of Everest, this time created using Google's ImageFX. Flusser, in Into the Universe of Technical Images, suggests that technical images are not two-dimensional surfaces, but dimensionless mosaics assembled from particles. They are born from and rely on technical texts, such as programming language, but also rely on Flusser's apparatus in order to be recalculated into more meaningful visual forms. These generative diffusion model AI images are literally mosaics of noise, cleared by machine learning algorithms into original technical imagery. Sarah Kember and Joanna Zielinska in Life After New Media describe the process of photography as an act of cutting, apprehending a moment from a continuous passage of observed time. The frames shown earlier from Knoll's film are literal cuts, but the CG images from Looking at Mountains are not cut from life. They are not frozen moments from a continuous sequence of events, but visually imply that perhaps they are. They are not created by the notion of a heroic photographer, far from it, but calculated by the reordering of a certain specific data. They are, in effect, photographic simulacra, in that they bear certain properties of what we traditionally consider photographs, but not all. But what are all the properties? Photography is no longer the narrow process it once was. The camera is not a passive observing instrument, to use Karan Barad's phrase. The camera, the frame, the printer, the computer, the algorithm, the network, the photographer, all the possibilities of Flusser's apparatus are all active agents in the constitution of what we can now consider a photograph. But all, including humans, are not necessarily required. Thank you.